Margaret Evans had lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood for nearly 20 years, raising her children and building a life with her late husband, Thomas, an Army veteran who had served with honor and sacrifice. When Thomas passed away, Margaret felt a profound emptiness consume her world. To cope with the loss, she placed a simple wooden bench in the front yard beneath a flowering dogwood tree as a memorial to him. Every morning she sat on that bench, coffee in hand, remembering his laughter, his strength, and the life they had shared. The bench was not merely furniture. It was a sacred symbol, a bridge to the past. Neighbors sometimes glanced curiously, and though most said nothing, Margaret could sense their discomfort with anything that broke the uniform image of the neighborhood. Still, she held on to her small act of remembrance, believing no one could object to something so personal, so deeply tied to love and grief. In Margaret's neighborhood, the Homeowners Association held significant power. They dictated paint colors, lawn heights, fence styles, and decorations, all in the name of community aesthetics. For years, Margaret had quietly followed these rules, painting shutters the approved shade, trimming hedges to regulation height. But the bench was different. It was not an ornament chosen from a catalog. It was a piece of her heart. Soon enough, whispers began among neighbors, suggesting the bench didn't fit the uniform look. The HOA board, composed of residents who valued control, eventually took notice. A letter appeared in Margaret's mailbox, informing her that the bench violated HOA standards and must be removed within 30 days. Reading the letter, Margaret felt anger and sorrow clash within her. Removing the bench would be like erasing Thomas's presence. She knew then that she would resist, no matter the consequences. The weeks that followed grew increasingly tense. Margaret received additional notices, each one harsher in tone, warning her of fines and legal action if she failed to comply. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, unwilling to take sides. Others quietly supported her, offering sympathetic words, though they hesitated to speak against the HOA openly. Margaret spent her evenings sitting on the bench, feeling the weight of the board's disapproval pressing in on her. The bench, once a place of peace, became a symbol of defiance and resilience. It reminded her of Thomas's own battles, of how he had faced adversity with quiet strength. She began to feel that defending the bench was not only about honoring his memory, but also about standing up for dignity, compassion, and humanity against rigid rules that lacked empathy. Margaret decided she would not yield. She wrote a heartfelt letter to the HOA explaining the bench's significance as a memorial to her husband, who had served his country with courage. She reminded them that neighborhoods were not only collections of houses, but communities built on shared values of respect and understanding. The board's response was cold and impersonal. Regulations were regulations. They threatened her with escalating fines, up to $1,000 if she did not comply. The financial strain worried Margaret, but her determination grew stronger. She told herself that some battles were worth fighting, that Thomas would have stood tall in her place. Sitting beneath the dogwood tree one quiet evening, she whispered into the fading light that she would protect the bench, no matter how difficult the road ahead became. Word of Margaret's struggle spread beyond the cul-de-sac. A neighbor posted about her situation on social media, sharing how the HOA was forcing a widow to remove her late husband's memorial bench. The post resonated with many, sparking outrage and sympathy. Messages of support poured in from veterans groups, community members, and even strangers who had lost loved ones. Neighbors who had once been silent began visiting Margaret, leaving flowers by the bench, showing solidarity. The HOA board, once confident in their authority, now faced growing pressure. The issue became larger than a single bench. It became a question of compassion versus bureaucracy. Margaret felt strengthened by the community's support. For the first time since Thomas's passing, she felt less alone, as though his memory had rallied others to stand beside her. Eventually, the HOA could no longer ignore the public outcry. Faced with overwhelming community support for Margaret, they rescinded their demand and allowed the bench to remain. When the news was announced, neighbors gathered around the dogwood tree, some with tears in their eyes, as Margaret sat quietly on the bench, hands folded in gratitude. The victory was not merely about a piece of furniture, it was about love, resilience, and the power of memory to overcome even the coldest rules. Margaret understood that her fight had become a legacy, not only honoring Thomas's service, but also teaching her community the value of empathy and humanity. As she sat on the bench each morning, she no longer felt the sting of disapproval, but the warmth of collective respect. The bench remained where it belonged, a permanent symbol of devotion and courage, reminding everyone who passed by that love endures, even in the face of rigid conformity.